The Delphi murders case, the haunting down the hill audio, the years of mystery. But Richard Allen's trial has really blown this whole case wide open. And that's where our deep dive starts today. We're going to look at the most fascinating new details that have emerged.
It is remarkable how after, 5 years, countless tips, and 2 different suspect sketches, investigators finally arrest Richard Allen, a man who was interviewed in 2017 and admitted to being on the trail.
Right. It makes you wonder if he was the killer all along. Why wasn't he caught sooner?
Well, that's the most intriguing part, you see. Allen initially told investigators he hadn't seen anyone on the trail, but then in a 2022 interview, his story changed. He places himself at the bridge, claiming he was watching fish.
Okay, red flag number one. But it's the bullet that really raises questions, right?
Absolutely. A seemingly insignificant detail at the time, a single unspent .40 caliber bullet found between the girls' bodies, became crucial evidence. Forensic analysis linked it directly to Allen's gun. While it wasn't the murder weapon, it wasn't fire, the fact that it had been cycled through his firearm changes everything.
Yeah, that one bullet, years later, it really speaks to those seemingly insignificant details in an investigation. Was he trying to intimidate them, threaten them?
That's what investigators are trying to decipher. This, along with other evidence and his changing story, ultimately led to his arrest. But then there's another layer to this story that's even more disturbing. The crime scene itself.
Chilling, isn't it? The girls' bodies were deliberately posed, and there was something almost ritualistic about the scene. Like what?
The defense is suggesting that this was more than just an attempt to conceal the bodies. They claim that branches and sticks were deliberately arranged around the girls.
It's like something out of a movie. Those V-shapes, the asterisk-like formation, the antler shapes described in the court documents, it all suggests intentionality.
It raises the question, why would someone stage a crime scene like this? What message were they trying to send? Now, the prosecution maintains this was simply concealment, but the defense is presenting a far more unsettling theory, ritualistic sacrifice. They claim the girls were victims of a group known as Odinists.
Odinists? That sounds like something straight out of, Norse mythology.
Exactly. It's a pagan religion that draws from ancient Norse beliefs, focusing on things like war, death, wisdom, and magic. And some factions of Odinism have been linked to white supremacist groups.
And how does this connect to the Delphi murders?
The defense alleges that one of the girls' mothers had previously dated a man of color and that this relationship was the motive behind the attack.
Oh, wow. They're suggesting a hate crime disguised as a ritualistic killing.
That's the defense's claim. But the judge has prohibited them from delving too deeply into this theory, barring them from naming specific individuals they believe to be involved, or even mentioning Odinism during the trial.
It makes you think, though, about ritualistic killings and how common they actually are. I mean, it sounds so horrific.
Well, ritualistic homicides do occur, but they're not as frequent as, we might think. These crimes typically feature symbolism, specific methods of killing, and sometimes even a secondary crime scene.
What exactly is a secondary crime scene?
It's a location separate from where the murder took place that holds significance for the killer or for the ritual itself. It could be where they dispose of a body or maybe even conduct a ceremony. Think of it as a scene linked to the crime by the killer, but not by the act itself.
So are they saying there might be another location connected to Abby and Libby's murders?
Well, that's unclear at this point. The defense is focusing on the symbolism found at the original crime scene to try and support their Odinist theory. Whether or not there's a secondary crime scene remains to be seen.
Okay, so we've got a seemingly normal guy from town suddenly at the center of this case, the strange clue of the bullet, and now a possible ritualistic crime. But it gets even more complicated when you consider Allen's alleged confessions.
Yes, this adds yet another layer of complexity, and a very disturbing one at that. Allen allegedly confessed to the murders over 60 times in jailhouse phone calls.
60 times?
Ah.
That's a lot of confessions. How could someone confess that many times and still plead not guilty?
Well, that is the central question this trial is attempting to answer. The defense argues that these confessions were coerced, made when Allen wasn't in his right mind.
I have to hear these confessions. Is there any audio of them?
We do. This clip is from one of many recorded phone calls. This one between Allen and his wife. Have a listen.
Wow. It's hard to listen to, isn't it? He sounds so defeated. Do we know what he says in the full confessions?
The details of the confessions haven't been publicly released. It's likely they won't be revealed until they're presented in court. What we do know is that he repeatedly admits to killing the girls.
So if he's claiming a pagan cult was responsible, why would he confess so many times? Is it possible he's trying to protect someone else?
That's certainly a possibility. Or perhaps he's trying to manipulate the system, hoping to appear mentally unstable and avoid a conviction.
Okay, so we have the crime scene, the suspect, the confessions. But could one man, especially someone of Alan's stature, really overpower and kill two teenage girls in such a rugged area?
That's another point the defense is raising. They argue it would have been impossible for Allen to control two victims, dispose of evidence, and navigate that difficult terrain alone.
Are they suggesting he had an accomplice?
While they haven't named anyone specifically, the defense has presented witness accounts that describe seeing either a different person or multiple individuals in the area.
So we're back to the question. One killer or many?
And the lack of DNA evidence just adds to the mystery. Does it point to more than one person involved or a meticulous killer who took precautions to avoid leaving a trace? The jury has a very complex puzzle to solve.
It's true. This case is full of twists and turns. What's the feeling in Delphi with this trial underway?
Well, Delphi is a small town, and they've been living under the weight of this unsolved case for years now. This trial represents a chance for the town to finally get some answers and for the victims' families to get justice.
You've given us so much to think about already. What are the key things our listeners should be keeping in mind as we move forward with this deep dive?
I think the Delphi murders case really highlights how a seemingly straightforward investigation can take unexpected turns, leading down a rabbit hole of complexities.
We started with a grainy image and a voice saying, "Down the hill," and now we're talking Norse mythology and the psychology of false confessions.
That's exactly right. It's a reminder to stay objective, consider all angles, and allow the evidence, not speculation, to guide us as we try to understand this case.
I'm completely hooked. What happens next in the trial?
Well, we'll be back next week to cover exactly that. Stay tuned.
Okay, we're back with part 2 of our deep dive into the Delphi murders trial. And I'm already eager to hear what else has emerged.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride so far, hasn't it? Last time, we were discussing the possibility that Alan may not have acted alone.
Yeah, and there were so many questions left unanswered. Like, if there was an accomplice, what was their role? Could one person have really controlled two victims in that environment, killed them, and disposed of the evidence without a trace? It seems almost impossible.
And this is where the location itself becomes really a critical piece of the puzzle. Down the hill, those words from Libby's phone, they've become so chillingly iconic. Remember, the girls were found near Deer Creek, about a half a mile from the Moon and High Bridge where they were last seen.
Yeah, it's a rugged, isolated area, almost impossible to imagine something so horrific happening there.
Exactly, and some experts have suggested that navigating that terrain while controlling and killing two victims would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for just one person.
But we know Alan lived in Delphi, and he even admitted to being on the trail that day. Is it possible he knew that area well enough to have pulled this off alone? Maybe he had a favorite fishing spot down by the creek, or some other reason to be familiar with that specific location?
That's a theory investigators are actively pursuing. They're trying to determine if that particular spot where the girls were found, held any significance for Alan or if it was simply a random location.
So the location itself might hold vital clues. What other avenues are investigators exploring?
One fascinating aspect of this case is how investigators are using technology to piece together a timeline of Alan's movements that day. Think of it as a digital footprint. They're analyzing his cell phone data, GPS location history, even his online activity.
Wow, it's amazing how much information can be gleaned from our digital interactions these days.
It really is. And they're also meticulously going through surveillance footage from local businesses, hoping to place him near the crime scene around the time Abby and Libby disappeared.
It seems like in this day and age, it's nearly impossible to truly disappear. There's always some digital trace, some camera footage, something that can place you at the scene.
That's true, and technology has revolutionized criminal investigations. But it's not just about placing someone at the scene, it's about building a solid chain of events and proving their involvement beyond a reasonable doubt.
So what happens if Alan's defense team argues that the cell phone data or online activity is unreliable, or that it doesn't actually prove he was at the murder scene?
That's where the prosecution's expertise comes in. They have to present this digital evidence to the jury in a way that's clear, concise, and easily understandable. They need to demonstrate a direct link between Alan's digital trail and the murders, while also addressing any counter-arguments the defense may raise.
It sounds like the prosecution has a very challenging task ahead of them.
They do, especially given that their strongest evidence, those multiple confessions from Allen, is already being challenged by the defense.
It's mind-boggling that someone could confess over 60 times and still have a chance at acquittal. What are the defense's arguments against these confessions?
Their strategy is to argue that these confessions were made under duress, that Allen was either coerced or manipulated into admitting guilt.
But how do you prove coercion? Unless there's clear evidence of physical force or threats, wouldn't the prosecution simply counter by saying that he confessed because he was guilty?
It's a complex legal area, and the defense could try to demonstrate that Allen was, mentally vulnerable at the time of the confessions, maybe susceptible to suggestion or seeking attention, perhaps even notoriety.
So are you saying they might call in psychological experts to assess Allen's mental state, perhaps presenting evidence of a history of mental health issues to support their claim?
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see what kind of experts they bring in and how they use their testimony to try and discredit the confessions.
We've talked about the location, the digital trail, the confessions, but what about the motive? Why would Richard Allen, this seemingly normal guy from town, commit such a horrific act?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, one that the prosecution hasn't definitively answered. However, there are several theories circulating.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
One theory suggests that Allen might have been stalking the girls, possibly having developed an unhealthy obsession with them.
But wasn't there something about, like, no known prior contact between Allen and the girls?
That's right. At least not any that has been made public. But just because it hasn't been reported doesn't mean it didn't happen. Investigators are likely meticulously examining Allen's past, looking for any indication of predatory behavior, connections to the victims, anything that might point to a motive.
So that's one possibility. What are some of the other theories?
Another, and this is purely speculative at this point, is that the murders were a crime of opportunity. Perhaps Allen saw the girls on the trail, took advantage of their vulnerability, and the situation escalated.
Because you're suggesting a random act of violence, no premeditation or planning.
Yeah.
It's hard to fathom something so horrific happening so spontaneously.
I agree, but sometimes the most senseless crimes are the hardest to explain. And let's not forget the possibility that Allen didn't act alone.
Right. That adds another layer of complexity. So the prosecution needs to establish a motive, and they also need to prove that Allen either acted alone or, if there was an accomplice, demonstrate their role in the crime.
Precisely. It's a complex case with many threads, and it'll be up to the jury to carefully consider all of them before reaching a verdict.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and it seems the trial is far from over. What should we expect next?
Well, the trial continues, and we can expect more twists and turns as the prosecution and defense present their cases.
I can't wait to see what unfolds next.
We'll be back next week to bring you up to speed on the latest developments and dissect the closing arguments.
I'll be counting down the days. And we're back, ready to unravel the final chapter in our deep dive into the Delphi murders trial.
Yeah, the tension has been building, and now we're at a pivotal point. Both the prosecution and the defense have rested their cases, presenting all the evidence, the arguments, the theories.
This case has felt like a roller coaster ride, hasn't it? From those chilling crime scene details to the arrest of Richard Allen, those shocking confessions, and the defense's attempt to shift the blame.
It's been a whirlwind of information, that's for sure. Now it all comes down to the jury to sift through the evidence and decide Richard Allen's fate.
So let's talk about those closing arguments. What were the prosecution's strongest points?
The prosecution really hammered home the presence of Allen's DNA on Abby Williams' sweatshirt. They argued that this, combined with that unspent bullet from his gun being found at the scene, places him undeniably at the location where the murders happened.
Okay, and what about the confessions? Did they play a prominent role in the prosecution's closing arguments?
Absolutely they did. The prosecution played those, chilling recordings of Allen's jailhouse phone calls, reminding the jury of his repeated admissions of guilt. Their argument hinged on the idea that these confessions, made freely and without coercion, were the most damning evidence against him.
But the defense has been working to discredit those confessions, right? What was their strategy in the closing arguments?
The defense stuck to their stance that Allen, wasn't of sound mind when he made those confessions. They argued that he was pressured, that his words were manipulated and taken out of context. Their closing argument urged the jury to focus on the lack of physical evidence directly linking Allen to the killings, suggesting the prosecution's case is built on speculation.
So in a sense, the defense is saying, He may have said it, but that doesn't mean he did it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They were trying to, like, sow seeds of doubt about the confessions, emphasizing the lack of DNA evidence on the victims' bodies and the lack of a clear motive.
So we've heard the prosecution's case, he confessed, he was there, he's guilty. Then we heard the defense counter with, the confessions aren't reliable, the physical evidence is weak, and there's no clear motive. What about that Odinist cult theory? Did that factor into the defense's closing argument?
It's interesting you bring that up because no, they didn't. They were limited by the judge's earlier ruling, prohibiting them from mentioning Odinism or naming specific individuals.
So they weren't able to fully utilize that as their, main defense strategy?
Not in a direct way. However, they did still emphasize the possibility that other suspects were involved and suggested the crime scene could have been staged specifically to mislead investigators.
So while they couldn't directly name the Odinists, they were still able to introduce that element of doubt.
Exactly. By focusing on poking holes in the prosecution's case, highlighting inconsistencies, and emphasizing the lack of a motive, they were aiming to raise enough uncertainty that the jury couldn't confidently reach a guilty verdict.
Okay, so where does that leave us? The jury's deliberating now, right?
Yes. They've been sequestered, meaning they're completely isolated. No phones, no internet, no news from the outside world. They'll be carefully reviewing all the evidence, discussing their interpretations, and eventually they'll reach a verdict.
This entire case has been like something out of a true crime documentary.
Yeah.
All the twists and turns, shocking revelations, and now the long wait for the jury to come to a decision. It's hard to believe it's not like a fictional thriller.
Yeah.
But this is real life, and the stakes are incredibly high.
This case demonstrates the intricate complexities of the justice system and the importance of due process. It's a reminder that even seemingly open and shut cases can be layered with nuance and ambiguity.
Yeah. So let's talk about what happens next. If the jury comes back with a guilty verdict, what does that mean for Richard Allen?
If he's found guilty of both counts of murder, he's looking at a potential sentence of 90 to 130 years in prison.
That's a very significant sentence.
Yeah.
But what happens if the jury finds him not guilty? Does that mean the case is closed?
Not necessarily. The prosecution could appeal the verdict, or they could decide to continue their investigation, possibly looking for new evidence or even potential accomplices.
So even with a not guilty verdict, there's no guarantee of closure for Abby and Libby's families.
Unfortunately, no. It's been a long and winding road, and regardless of the outcome, this case will continue to have a deep impact on the Delphi community and everyone who has followed this tragic story.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but also, emotionally heavy. It's hard to imagine the pain and suffering these families have endured.
Absolutely. And while this chapter of the story may be coming to a close, the search for truth and justice will likely continue for a long time.
What's the most important thing you think our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
I think it's important to remember that the pursuit of justice is rarely a straight line. It's a process, a complex one, full of legal intricacies, conflicting evidence, and the weight of human emotion. While we often crave quick and simple answers, the reality is much more complicated.
Well said. On that note, we'll leave you with this thought-provoking question to ponder. What does justice truly mean in a case as complex and heartbreaking as the Delphi murders? What does it look like, and is true closure even possible? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.